What is up, team? Welcome back to the show. Today, I am joined by Peter Fitschen. Peter, thank you for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So, for the listeners who might not know, could you just give us a quick background on who you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, so I have been, competing in bodybuilding. I've been training since 2002, competing in bodybuilding since 2004. So actually, this week marks 17 years since my first show. So it's been a while.
Right.
Over the years, I've dieted down to stage lean 6 times. I've done, I think, 13 shows now. Won my natural pro card in 2012, and then competed. The last time I competed was last summer, so I've competed recently. And then on the education side of things, I got a bachelor's in biochem, a master's in physiology, and a PhD in nutritional sciences from the University of Illinois. So I went to college 11 and a half years. I got a CSCS, so I'm a certified strength conditioning specialist, and I coach clients, primarily competitors at this point. The majority of my clients compete or want to compete, but I have a handful of non-competitors still as well. Um, I've been coaching full time since I finished school in 2015. So I mean, this is kind of my full time thing. I've done some speaking and over the years and wrote a book with Cliff Wilson that came out a couple of years ago. But yeah, a lot of my focus at this point is coaching.
Absolutely. And one of the main reasons I want to have you on, again, like I've been absorbing your content for a long time. The book Bodybuilding that you're referencing with Cliff Wilson was such a helpful book for me. I know I've referenced that a ton of times when like troubleshooting things with clients, not like clients getting ready to hop on stage, but just like even gym pop clients trying to get leaner. Such a helpful book. And definitely the best that I've read of that nature. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on again is you're someone that has taken a lot of people to the point where they are very, very, very lean. So I really wanted this to be a conversation around kind of what that process is like taking someone from, let's say, like a male around 12 to 15% body. And we not to set a parameter on like the starting body fat, but basically getting someone to the point where they're like absolutely diced to like a stage level leanness. So first and foremost, and again, this will probably depend a bit, but can you give us a general, like approximately most men that are going to hop on stage? And similarly for women, like an approximate body fat where they will typically be like when they hop on stage. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, I don't really have clients worry about what the body fat percentage is. Most of the ways you can measure body fat percentages are going to have error, especially the stuff people have available. A lot of people use like BIA, and that can have like an 8 to 10% error, I
Right.
believe, on individual measurement. Like it's not close. And so I found that a lot over the years that a lot of times people who are measuring their body fat regularly, like with calipers or BIA or something, since the measurements have so much error and there's so many things that can impact what that number says, I find a lot of times like people they put too much stock in it, and it might lead to more stress and more panic than benefit. So like for example, if somebody it's completely possible for someone to be leaner, but since the measurement has so much error and variability, like the body fat number says the same or higher, even though like visually they're leaner.
Right.
And so that can really mess with someone's head. I've seen it myself when we did the case study on me during my 2012 prep that we published. I got a DEXA every single month, and it didn't always line up with what I was seeing visually. And so it really messed with my head. And I had seen clients doing the same over the years. And so, yeah, I got to the point where I just, quit recommending that clients, do body fat tests,
Okay.
and quit worrying about it. And so instead, things that I would worry about are kind of a combination of, one, what direction is the scale moving and how quickly is it moving there? Two, what is your strength doing in the gym? And three, what's happening visually, which is more of a longer term thing. But if the first two are moving in the right direction, like the scale's trending down, strength isn't dropping, like the visual change will happen.
Mhm.
And so those are what I more so worry about. And I when someone's stage lean, I would base that on how they look and not necessarily a number, because I think we all know someone who was dieting for a show, didn't get lean enough, but was walking around telling everyone they were 3 or 4% body fat or something, just absurdly lean, and they
Right.
weren't lean enough on stage. Like I don't care what that test said. Like when you got on stage, you weren't lean enough. So, I've seen plenty of people like that over the years. So I mean, I really wouldn't base it on a number. I would base it on a look.
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like then primarily what you're looking for, and I want to get into later on like the process or like the process you use to make adjustments. But it sounds like primarily we're looking at, okay, how is my training? How is the weight changing? And then how do you look? Past that, are there any other like primary metrics that you're looking at?
I mean, there are other things that are obviously important. I mean, those are probably the three biggest things, but I mean, other things are important too. I mean, especially if you're working with someone who's general population, how are you feeling? If people are noticing visual change, how are your clothes fitting? But I think for someone dieting for a show too, I mean, things like how they're feeling and hunger, energy, recovery from workouts, things like that, sleep quality, all of that is important as well.
Okay. Okay. Absolutely. So let's dig into that in a bit. What are you looking for to indicate, okay, this person is ready to take it to this level of leanness versus like, yo, as much as you might want to get super lean, you're just not ready for that. What are you kind of looking for there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think prep isn't something you can just kind of jump into. I think you need to be ready, right? Like you need to be prepared. It's not a couch to 5K. When we were writing our book, they were trying to say, oh, this should be like a couch to 5K, and we're like, no, this doesn't work that way.
Right.
This isn't couch to 5K, and like we have like a whole couple chapters about like where you should actually be at before starting to prep, because you don't just jump into it. It usually doesn't go well. And so yeah, you want to have lifted weights for a while and built a muscle base. You see a lot of times people start lifting weights and immediately start dieting for a show. Like, hey, I'm dieting for my first show and I just started lifting. They're probably not going to have a ton of muscle on stage.
Right.
And even some of the less muscular, less extreme divisions, like even bikini, requires muscle. And most really good bikini competitors have a good amount of muscle and are pretty strong and have been lifting for a
Right.
while. And so yeah, I think you need to be lifting for a while and build a muscle base. I think you're going to want to make sure that you haven't been dieting for a while. You're going to want to go into your prep like just mentally, physically ready. Like, hey, I've been out of a deficit for a while. Like, you know, my metabolism's cranking, hormones are in a good spot. I'm eating a lot of food. Feeling good, strong in the gym. I mentally haven't dieted for a while, so I can adhere to whatever I got to do. I think also just really making sure you can like adhere to a cut, I think is important. So maybe having cut at some point before in your life before you do a prep, to make sure like, hey, I can actually do a cut, not a cut to stage lean, but just like I can actually adhere. I think is important to know. And then other things I think are important, would be your overall relationship with food. I think financially being in a spot where, because competing is not cheap, so I think that's important. Just you know things like that. Going to a show is probably a good idea. Seeing what you're getting into so ahead of time. All of those type of things are important, I think, before you're even starting to prep for a show.
Okay. Okay. Absolutely. Is there a certain amount of time versus like from the previous time this individual, and again, this probably varies more on like how they're feeling than anything else, but I would be interested to hear your thoughts from like, hey, this is the last time you were super lean. We need to give you about this long before we push it again. Do you have like any time constraints on that?
Well, yeah. So I think it depends on the person, like you said. So if you look at some of the literature, it typically takes like 4 to 6 months for someone's hormones, metabolic rate, everything to get back to normal after a prep, assuming they've regained weight.
Right.
So, I mean, I would say that's the minimum amount of time till you start dieting again. So that means that really the minimum amount of time between shows would probably be a year. First, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I probably wouldn't be competing spring, fall, or anything like that. Like, if you're competing this spring, the soonest you should be thinking about competing again would be the next spring. But that's assuming someone doesn't need to make any improvements or doesn't care, like if they're any better the next time, because they're probably going to look the same, and depending on their situation, maybe even touch worse. You
Right.
know what I mean? Like and so you're not going to see a lot of improvements unless someone's really early on or really had suboptimal prep methods or didn't get lean enough the first time around or has just crazy genetics, any combination of those things. You might see, then you might see visual change from the first show to, uh, or from year one to year two. But in most cases, you're not going to see that. So, I mean, if you're going to want to see change, I would say probably at least 2 to 3 years. Probably someone who hasn't been lifting as long, maybe the shorter end of that, or someone with good genetics, something like that, or someone with suboptimal methods going to something more optimal.
Right.
Maybe the shorter end of that. But 3 4 years. I mean, I've been doing 4 between shows a lot of the last few times I've dieted down. If you want to see visual change for an average person, although I've seen clients make pretty good progress even in 2 years. It really just depends on the situation. But yeah, I think if you want to make progress, like if you're competing this spring, the soonest I would probably even think of competing again would be like spring of 2023, then like 2 years from now. But it could be longer. And I don't know. For me personally, at this point, I've dieted down enough times. I've done this long enough. I've accomplished enough that I personally don't want to diet down unless I know I'm going to be better the next time. And if that means it's going to be a little bit longer till I diet down, I'm fine with that. Like it's at this point for me, it's not about I need to win this or win that. It's more about like how much better can I get the next time.
No, absolutely. And I think that's important for people to hear too, not even like specific to bodybuilding, but even like a gym pop athlete who is always trying to stay super lean, but also again, like, hey, I want to continuously improve my physique. And that's like, we can't, like you said, like that, like 4 to 6 months is kind of that bare minimum to where like, okay, I've been out of the diet this long. If you got super lean, of course, like all this is within context, but okay, now am starting to feel kind of normal again. And then like if we go right back into the diet, you're probably gonna have a very time ever building muscle, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're probably not going to add a whole lot of size if you're always dieting. And I mean, people always say, "Well, I've been out of a deficit for 6 months since my show." Yeah, but it takes 4 to 6 months to get back to normal. So that doesn't mean you're in a great spot to be gaining muscle. That's just getting you back to like normal. So if you get back to normal and then you diet down again, like I wouldn't expect much for progress. You're probably gonna look the same. And if you don't even let yourself get back to normal and you just start cutting again right away, you're probably gonna look worse.
No, for sure. And I think that's kind of like a more probably more in gym pop, but I feel like I see that so often where people always want to diet, but it's
Yeah,
again,
yeah, you see that in bodybuilding too. I mean, as much information that's out there now, you still see the people who start competing in the spring when shows start in their area, compete at every show in their area throughout the year, stop in the fall, really only because shows stop in most areas of the country over winter, and then pick right back up in the spring when they start again. Um, like that person never looks better, and they look the same every time at best, and maybe even worse over time. And they're not adding any muscle really, probably because they're always dieting. And you usually like there's pretty good burnout there. Like the people
right,
who, I've been my first show was 17 years ago, and I'm still doing this. Um, I like the list of people still doing this longer than me seems to be getting shorter and shorter and shorter every year. And but I think but there's still guys out there like the Jeff Alberts of the world who have a decade or more on me still. But the reason people like him or I been able to do this so long is there's some sort of balance there. It's
right.
not compete, compete, compete. The people who compete, compete, compete and never take any time off and they're competing in every show every year, they're not lasting 17 years. They're done within 3 years, or something like that most of the time.
Absolutely. And again, I think it's such an important thing for people to understand. So when it comes to, okay, we're identifying, actually take me through the process. So when it is like, okay, someone comes to you, hey, I want to get on stage. Is it typically like we are going to set, I imagine at about this weight, this is where you'll be, like have the physique we want? Or is it kind of like, hey, we'll go by feel and I'm approximating like maybe about a pound of loss per week for the next however many weeks? Or can you talk us through that process?
Yeah, so I think it depends if the person's competed and been lean before. Because if they've competed and they've been stage lean before, that gives you a pretty good idea of the number you're shooting for. Because like a natural isn't going to be adding drastic, like you don't see like tons of, pounds added between, from one year to the next, right? A natural, like you do in the enhanced side of the sport. So usually, someone who's been stage lean before, you have a pretty good idea. Someone who hasn't, or someone who's new, you might have to take an educated guess, and that's where being flexible with show selection can be important. I'm a huge fan of when someone starts out, we find several shows that could be an option, knowing that they're not going to do all of them, but just find some options. And then that way, based on how they're progressing, when they're ready, if they're ready a little early, we target something on the earlier side of that. If they're not ready till maybe it takes a little more time to get them there, then maybe we target something on the later side of that. And that's totally fine, and that way we are basing when they're competing on when they're ready versus just some arbitrary date, because that usually doesn't end well for most first-time competitors, and is probably the biggest reason why most people aren't lean enough the first time on stage, because they pick an arbitrary date and don't give themselves enough time for it. And then as far as kind of determining how long, for most people, I always like looking at like kind of a ratio of like weeks to diet to pounds to lose kind of ratio. So if someone has 20 pounds to lose, I'd ideally want to start prep with more weeks than that to diet. That way we can shoot for a pound a week, or maybe if it's a bigger guy, maybe a pound and a half a week. But then we have time, so like plateaus are going to happen, but if you have more weeks to diet than pounds to lose, you lose a week in there, you're still all right. You also have time for things like diet breaks, something like if there's a stressful week during life or adherence is getting lower, bumping food up, and helping them stay, that can help them stay consistent. And yeah, you lose a week of dieting, but you have that time built in. And then also if they can be ready a couple weeks early, that's great. I mean, ideally all my clients would be ready like 3-4 weeks out. Because then you can look at some peaking stuff, you can reverse them into shows, test out some larger carb loads if you think they can tolerate them, and do it during a time where there's no consequence, like there would be doing it the final week. So that way you keep your peak week predictable. But yeah, so I like to look at, like, in an ideal world, keeping that pounds to lose, weeks to diet higher than pounds to lose. That's a ratio I look at a lot of times, that I talk to with clients a lot of times about, because, if you start prep 25 weeks out, 20 pounds to lose, you kind of keep an eye on that down the road, and as you go, right? So now maybe you're 10, okay, you got 10 pounds more to lose. We got 12 weeks. Okay, we're still in a good spot. And, if we start getting to the point where it's like, okay, we got 8 weeks and we got 8 pounds, that's where you got to get to jump on adjustments a little bit quicker, because you don't really have time. A plateau will put you behind, and now you got to start dieting faster and faster, and that's not what you want.
Right.
You're more susceptible for muscle loss when you're really, really lean, especially compared to where you are at first. So if you're going to see faster rates of loss, you actually want to see them early on in your cut, when body fat's higher, when you haven't been dieting as long. Because when food's probably gonna be higher at that point, and that cardio lower, and that's the point you're less susceptible to muscle loss than when you're extremely lean. And so I think a lot of people go about it completely backwards in that sense, like they fall behind and then they try to crash down at the last minute at the end, but that's when you're going to lose muscle, and that's where you're most susceptible to muscle loss. So I think just keeping in mind pounds to lose versus weeks to diet, is a good way to kind of keep yourself on track.
Okay, that makes complete sense. And then is there a typical kind of cap to a percentage of total body weight loss that you like to cut it into? Like, okay, like per diet phase, like, hey, if we had to lose more than like 10% or 15% of your total body weight, is there like okay, we should probably split this up into chunks, or hey, you might need another 6 months, right? Is there like a limit to that?
Yeah, I generally like to split it into chunks. If somebody has quite a bit to lose, just from an adherence standpoint, like they're probably only going to be able to stay in a deficit and adhere for so long. But it depends on the person, right? Someone who has, say 40 pounds to lose, I bet the first 20 of that comes off pretty easy. Like I wouldn't break that into a chunk. You know what I mean? Like if it's going well and it's coming off easy, I don't just purposely stop the diet for the sake of stopping the diet. I'll throw in diet breaks and break things up, but usually it's more so when it's needed. I generally don't like to stop something that's going well. And that's the same way I approach deloads in training too. Like I don't like planning them an arbitrary amount of weeks, because if someone doesn't need it, then why would you take one?
Right.
Or vice versa. If someone needs it sooner, then why would we? You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly.
Same with the diet break. With diet breaks and dieting for a show, though, if there's a timeline there's only so much you can do. Like there's going to have to be some pushing. You can't always
Right.
be diet breaking, right?
Right.
And so, uh, but yeah, I generally like breaking it up, and I usually base it on the person and how the person's doing, how their consistency is, how weight loss is. If things are going well, we keep going. If not, yeah, we'll break it up a little bit.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. So as far as rates of loss go,
Mhm.
I know, and this is actually something I want to ask you about as well, being a little bit more aggressive at the beginning. But what is typically like your rate of loss you're gonna? And again, I know it probably varies, but is there like a typical target rate of loss you like to see?
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at the literature, somewhere between 0.5% to 1% of body weight weekly is a good spot. And as you get leaner, probably closer to the lower end of that. Um, so for most guys, pound and a half a week, maybe a little quicker than that at first for a bigger guy, is probably a good average. Most women, you're probably looking at about a pound, and you're doing pretty good with a female prep if you can average that over the whole prep, because that can be pretty tough, especially for smaller women. It might be even lower than that. And so that's where just having more weeks to diet than pounds to lose is really important in those situations, especially with a woman too, because with a monthly cycle, there could be, depending on how she responds. Some women have an uptick the week before, some the week of, some you can't tell what week of the month it is. Everyone's different, but if there's like a week of the month where the weight just ticks up because of a woman's monthly cycle, and you can't tell what's actually happening because it's just some water weight for the week, and then it comes back off the next week. If you're losing that week every month, like that's a week that you don't know if you know what I mean, if
Right.
you need to adjust, do you not need to adjust? And I would rather just have more time and we just stay consistent that week. We see where things average out, because you don't know, and I don't want to be cutting just for the sake of cutting, and so
Absolutely.
um, that I think that just there's a lot of reasons why I would just more time, like just slower,
Okay.
more time, is what I'm always telling people.
So with women, then do you typically set like a longer prep timeline than men?
Yeah, I think it also, yeah, I would say, because especially if like a smaller woman versus a larger man, like, so if it's a guy who's competing, who's like if a natural guy who's like over 6 feet tall, that's going to be 190 something on stage. I mean,
Right.
he's going to be able to lose a lot faster than just from a percent of body weight a week standpoint. Like he's going to be able to lose a lot faster than a woman who's barely 5 feet tall and is maybe 100 pounds on stage.
Right.
I've had a couple of clients as small as like 4'10", like 90 pounds on stage. And so when you're that small, the rate, I mean, a point 6, point 7 pound loss is actually a really good loss for someone who's 90 some pounds,
Right.
and not 5 feet tall. Versus someone who's six something and 200. That guy can get away with pound and a half or 1 point, that pound and a half, or maybe even two, um,
Absolutely.
at times.
Okay, okay, and that makes that, like, the context of it is so important too. That's what, like, we work with a lot of women, but like I'm 6'3", I'm 230 pounds. So I just started my fat loss phase, and it's like 3 weeks in, I'm down 10 pounds, and like I put my journey out there too, and like some of the women that I'm working with that are like, hey, like, why are you losing so much quicker? And it's like, well, I weigh 100 pounds more than you. Like, you have to understand the context of all this as well. Like, if we're looking at percentage of body weight lost, we're in a very similar place here.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I remember my wife and I, because I calculated that at one point, because we both dieted for shows and we competed last summer, and at one point I was doing the math, and we were in pretty much the same spot from like percentage standpoints of weight lost, and even like a percentage of like how much lower our food was than maintenance, and or than like off season, and you know what I mean? Like it's just the app, so like from a percentage, like a relative standpoint, it was the same. It's just I'm bigger than her, so you know, my intake's going to be higher. My rate of loss is going to be a little bit higher.
Absolutely. So it doesn't sound like you're gonna intentionally push it along. And I don't want to put words in your mouth either, but it doesn't sound like you're gonna intentionally like be more aggressive at the start per se. But if we lose a little bit quicker at the start, we're okay with that. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, I a lot of times with people at the start, I want to see loss from the start, and so some of it depends on the person. Some people want to be a little less aggressive at the start and don't want to give up as much food and see if they can get away with a little bit more for a little longer. I'm okay with that, if they're but if we're not losing, I'll push. One thing I typically do at the start of, I've started doing more so at the start of cuts, is not starting with any refeeds until I make sure they're losing.
Right.
Um, you know, so like if you don't take someone's food low enough that they're losing the first week, I don't have them refeed. Like I push more until we actually start losing, and then once they actually start losing, I start refeeding. That way, we're not losing time at the start. We're trying to keep it. Let's get this moving. Let's get this going.
Right.
Yeah, once I'm sure someone's losing, then I'll start incorporating refeeds and things also. But yeah, I think getting it off to a good start is a good idea. And if you're not seeing loss, I'll have someone start a cut on a Monday, have them eat like 3 days of like their new lower numbers, and if by like Thursday they're not losing, we're probably cutting more, because like at the start of a cut, not further in or anything, but like at the very beginning, like food's been high, whatever, and we just set some number. And if that's not low enough to see loss in the first few days, like even like water glycogen, you should be seeing some loss. Like I'll take it pretty quickly, and let's get this moving.
Uh,
Um,
And is that more? Do you feel like there's a psychological component to that too? And again, I imagine like some of this is different with like advanced bodybuilders, but I know like with a lot of our clients, we're very intentionally like more aggressive out of the gate, knowing that we can very easily dial it back. But like again, like seeing like week one, week two, okay, I'm changing quickly.
mhm.
It's to get so much better adherence throughout the cut.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the person though. You got to get their buy-in, because some people don't. You make a decent cut like that at first, and they may not be on board with that. So
Good
I
point.
think you have to know who you're working with too, and what they want and how they're feeling and things too. And so when I work with a new client, I have an initial call with all of them, and try to get a handle on some of that. You know what I mean, of where they're at, and um, try to kind of meet them where they're at, so that I can get some buy-in, and we can get things going. Because if a client, like, you don't have to always, your client and you don't always have to see eye to eye. We got some, I've had some good discussions with some of my really good clients back and forth on some things, and that we didn't quite see eye to eye on, and that's fine. But
Right.
if you need to at least, like, I don't care, like that's great. Like someone's thinking for themselves. That's,
Right.
let's discussion. I'm totally cool with that. But you need to have some buy-in from clients, like when they start, right? They need to, like, at least feel like you're going to be able to help them. You're going to be able to get them there. That your approach is something they're on board with. Like,
Right.
I find that, like, doing initial calls with clients, like, you can get a feel of that. You can kind of weed out what might not be a great fit
Okay.
for you.
Okay. No, that makes complete sense. So then it sounds like once we get a little bit deeper in the cut, it sounds like about 1% of body weight loss is kind of the upper limit of what you want to see.
Yeah, I mean, you might have a week here and there, because like I'll always look at weekly averages with people, and so you might have a week at here, in there, where maybe you're at like, maybe you're at, I don't know, like 1.2 or something like that. But if it's just 1 week, like 1.2%, that's like 1 week, not a big deal. And I kind of look at it too over the context of the entire diet. Like, how fast are we losing? So you've dropped 20 pounds, you're 200 pounds, you've dropped 20 pounds. How fast have you done that?
Right.
If have you done that in 5 weeks? That's way too fast. Because that's 4 pounds a week, that's 2% a week, that's too fast. Or have you done that in, like, you know, I don't know, 15 weeks, where that's like, 1.2 pounds a week, or 1.25 pounds a week. And so that's, you know, that's a great rate of loss. I think that's like 0.6, 0.7%. You know what I mean, in that situation. So I would look at it too over the course of the entire cut as well. When making some of those calls, I mean, there might just be a week where you lose a little quicker, a week you lose a little slower. Like that's going to happen, even if you're
Right.
looking at averages.
Okay. Okay. So when we come to what appears to be a stall, Do you have like kind of a process of like, okay, these are first we look to this, then we look to this to determine like where that could be coming from or like if an adjustment is truly needed? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. And so, um, I think it depends on the person. But if someone is pretty experienced tracking, I don't really dive into much of what they're eating because if they've competed before, they're pretty experienced tracking, they're pretty experienced competing, they've, been able to do it successfully. Usually I assume, you know what I mean? I assume that we're tracking accurately and we probably need some adjustments if nothing's changed in terms of like lifestyle or you know what I mean or anything that's come up. We probably need to adjust. If someone's newer to tracking, or if we're starting to get to really low intakes, or we're starting to get to places where I'm like, this is starting to get a little lower than maybe I would expect them to have to go to, then we start digging into what are you actually eating, and we look at what could be being missed. What are you know what I mean? Like, and it's amazing what you can find, when you start digging. I I had a client one time apply to work with me who said they were eating 800 calories a day and not losing weight. And I started digging into what they were actually eating and asking a bunch of questions, and they were really eating like 1,600 calories a
Right.
day from what I found. But I think it was even more than that because when we started them at 1,400, they were actually losing pretty steadily. So you know what I mean? Like I don't even think I found everything. It was just a matter of getting them tracking everything. Um, so I think, yeah, someone who's early on, especially someone who's Gen Pop, someone who hasn't tracked a lot, yeah, making sure that they're actually tracking accurately is important. I think making sure that they're not seeing a massive drop in activity. So I had a situation a few years ago where I had a client who they had dieted for a show successfully before, so I was like, all right, they're good, but they weren't losing, and I made like 3 rounds of adjustments in a row and still weren't losing. And they had dieted before. And I was like, okay, like I probably believe them that they're tracking accurately because they've done pretty well in shows before. And so I started asking about other things going on. And it turned out that they were a teacher. And so they were really active and, like in a classroom. And then this was right around the time the semester ended. And as I made more adjustments, like their school year was winding down and they were feeling more tired and sluggish. And so they just got through their workouts and didn't do much else the rest of the day. And so I was like, okay, well, we just need to get you moving more throughout the rest of the day like you were before. We don't really probably need to adjust. And that was all it took. And they started losing again. And so, yeah, I think things like that are important to look at. But if they're, plateaus are going to happen, even if someone does everything the right way. And so I think it's important to like make it clear to clients that that's okay, that's normal. Because like you'll have people who absolutely freak out when a plateau happens, and like they're doing something wrong or like things are going horribly, and I think just making it clear to them that that's normal, that happens. We would expect that along the way. You know what I mean? Like I think that's I think it's important to let clients know that also.
That makes complete sense. So then, are you typically setting a step goal as well, or when you talked about like that down regulation movement, how do you account for that?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the person. Most of my clients who are dieting for shows were probably using step counts because anyone who's been stage lean before will tell you you don't move when you're stage lean. Like I, I never, when I talk about this to anyone who's been stage lean, they're like, yeah, I feel like crap. I didn't do anything. Like I got through my workouts and did as little as possible, throughout the day. And so people don't move. And so I usually for most clients deep in prep, like it's more of a, hey, this is going to prevent you from seeing this massive drop off in activity that probably would happen if you just let it happen.
Right.
And so I use it for that. And even for like general population, especially clients with desk jobs, I think it can be really useful to make them aware that they need to get up and move more throughout the day, or if they've been sitting all day, go for a walk or something like that. It's something you can do anywhere, anytime. So like for someone who's busy, it isn't just telling them go. It's still cardio, it's still more activity, it's whatever you want to call it, right? But it's not go do X amount of time on a treadmill or whatever. Like they can just break it up however, wherever, whenever, and it fits into their life a lot better than doing just a ton of cardio.
Absolutely. So then when we are making this decrease in calories, and again, this is very much, and it depends, but is there a general like approximate percentage of calories like you like to drop, like 5 to 10% or anything of that nature, or is it just so individual?
Yeah, I would say it's individual. I mean, I would say, somewhere between 50 to, depending on the situation, 50 to 100 calories a day, maybe a touch more than that. Like, once you have someone losing, once they plateau, like it might take a decent drop to get someone losing initially, but once you get them losing, it usually doesn't take, you know what I mean, much like when a plateau happens to get them moving again. Like it might only take, 75, 100 calories, something like that. And then they're losing again for a few weeks. Um, and so, yeah, I would base it on the person, but it oftentimes doesn't have to be large, or as large as people think.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's so rare that I've made a calorie decreases over or like 100 calories drop per day, which is very interesting because again, you would almost think from like working through like the math of it that we would have to decrease a little bit more than that to like, okay, if you're at plateau to like get you back to losing like 1 to 1.5 pounds per week. But I
Yeah,
agree on that.
I mean, I say this is probably half science, half my thought, but there is data that people can defend against body weight gain and loss to some extent, right? So like you give people the same, there's studies in identical twins where you give them the same surplus of food, and the pair of twins that are identical, some pairs of twins gain more weight than other pairs of twins, but like the pairs of twins gain similar amounts of weight, so there's some genetic component to like defending against weight gain. They've done the same study in weight loss with like exercise and stuff, and
Yeah.
you see the same thing. The body can defend against gain and loss to some extent, and so some people have more or less adaptive metabolisms than others. Like when you're working with someone, some people's difference between where they gain weight and where they lose weight is like this giant range, and other people's it's more narrow. And so maintenance I don't know. I always like to think of maintenance as more of like a range,
Right.
rather than a point. And so, when, you get below, when you have this range and you're maintaining, this range, if you're up here, right below, like you're around the highest you can maintain on, you might have to make a decent drop to get below the range. Then as the range shifts down, you hit a plateau, and it might just take a little bit more of a decrease, you know what I mean, to go below that. Like you're like the low end of your range, just, if that makes sense. I'm kind of rambling it, but
No, that makes
um,
complete sense.
yeah. And so like I said, I don't know how much, some of that's science, some of it's my thought, but that's how I typically think about it at this point.
Okay. And if you don't mind, could you dig into, and this could probably be an entire podcast in itself, but the adaptive versus non-adaptive component of metabolism. Can you explain it to the listeners a bit, like what you mean by that?
Yeah. So if you look at like someone's energy expenditure, it usually comes from four places. It comes from a combination of total daily energy expenditure, which is like all of the calories needed to um, stay alive, right? Like if you were just laid in bed all day, it's the amount of, things like filtering blood, brain function, heart pumping, things like that. So your basal metabolic rate, people will say they have a low BMR. They don't, unless there's a medical condition. Basal metabolic rate is highly, highly, highly correlated with body size and lean mass. Um, those are the biggest correlates. And so when you look at like people in a lab, most of the time people will be within 5%, 10 at the most percent of what you'd predict. So basal metabolic rate doesn't differ much, and that one more so is just related to body size. There isn't a huge amount of adaptation there. Maybe some, but not a ton. Second place is thermic effect of food. So about 10% of the food that you eat is used to digest, absorb, metabolize the energy from that food. And so, someone who's dieting would have a lower thermic effect of food because they are eating less. So 10% of a smaller number is a smaller number. Um, Third is exercise. So that one's kind of variable. Someone who is smaller is going to burn fewer calories while exercising, but they might be doing more exercise. So that one's kind of variable. But the one that's highly, highly, highly adaptive is the fourth one, which is non-exercise activity. And so that includes things that are involuntary, like twitching and fidgeting, and things that are voluntary, like walking around, movement, often
Mhm.
like occupation or recreation or whatever. And so that can be really variable. Like people of the same height, weight, age, race, gender can differ by up to 2,000 calories a day. I've seen studies where the amount of calories burned from twitching can differ by like 700 calories from person to person. Non-exercise activity responds, like that's the part of metabolism that really responds. When you're in a deficit, that's the part that comes down. You a lot of, even if you're keeping your step counts up, like some of that involuntary stuff comes down. So that's the really, really, really adaptive part of metabolism, is that is non-exercise activity. And it'll respond up or down to under or overfeeding. But of the components of where energy is expended, that is where most of that metabolic adaptation is happening. And so someone with a really adaptive metabolism who really swings up or down, you have people like me, right? Like I fall into that category. My last off season, my peak intake was 4,200 calories a day. At the end of prep, my lowest intake was 2,000 a day. And when I'm dieting, I am pretty close to 3,000 a day before I even start seeing much in terms of loss. Like, I have to drop quite a bit. On the other hand, I had a client who was eating like 2,400 calories a day, dropped to like 1,900 calories a day. And it was like pound and a half weight loss, like clockwork, till they were within like 7 pounds a stage. It was like hardly any drop, hardly any adaptation. And yeah, it was super smooth. And so it really, those are extremes. Most people fall somewhere in between those extremes, but it can definitely differ. Some people, it can be a larger difference and a larger drop to see loss that, from where maintenance was at the start of a cut than others.
Absolutely. And it is, I think that's something that's important to understand as well, because you do have these individuals, like you said, like that's a 2,000 calorie swing from,
Yeah, it wasn't all at once, but yeah, yeah.
right. But again, it's easy to like, okay, I reverse dieted up to these crazy high calories. Like, and I think a lot of times even like coaches take this very far with like, this client had to diet super low with this other coach, but now I got them eating this much. And it's like, well, probably like like people that have like, we can reverse diet or like can eat that many calories and maintain are also probably people that are going to have to be a little bit more aggressive when to take calories lower than you expect when you diet. Would you say that's accurate or relative
Yeah,
to your
you will oftentimes see that.
right?
Yeah, and I think I always tell people there's a difference between, I have clients who end up at some crazy extremes at the end of prep, and they only get there because we had to go there, right? Like, so that there's a difference between going where you need to go during a prep and just being super aggressive for the sake of being aggressive because you're dieting for a show. I think we all know the people who they'll slash, they prep starting, so I'm going to like go super low carb and slash crazy amounts of calories and do cardio every single day from the start, and that's not needed from the start for most people. Maybe by the end for some people, you know what I mean. We're at some of these crazy extremes to get the last few pounds off. You're aiming for an extreme goal. When you get on stage, that might have to happen. But that's not what the entire way should be. Like the entire thing shouldn't be that miserable.
Right. Okay. Okay. Cool. So then when we're looking at diet breaks, what are typically the metrics or signs that you're looking for in a client that, hey, you probably need to take a diet break if we have time?
Yeah, well, as I say, time is if they have time is the big key, right? So that's, again, you have to give yourself time to be able to have that as an option. I think a lot of times I'll base it around like what's going on in their life. Like, do they have like a crazy busy week of work? Are they traveling? Do they have some family something come up? Family members in the hospital or dies or something at 6-8 weeks out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, or whatever. That's where having that ability to just bump food to maintenance for a little bit. I think that's important. I'd also look at adherence. If we're starting to see them like adherence not be great and adherence be kind of the reason that rate of loss is slowing, that's probably a good sign to incorporate a diet break. The data is definitely mixed on diet breaks and the effects on metabolic rate and things like that. But generally, like if someone's stalled out, like a plateau, when a plateau happens, that's generally when I would diet break. Whether that be just a general plateau or their adherence is getting lower to where that they stalled things out due to poor adherence and eating extra or doing less activity or what have you. Yeah, like I said before, I don't like to just, if someone's consistently losing that pound and a half a week, if we're shooting for that rate, I wouldn't stop it just to diet break unless something's coming up in their life. Like, hey, I've got this work trip or something this week. Okay, let's bump to maintenance for the week, make this more doable for you. And
Right.
then, go back at it when you're back home. But yeah, if someone's hitting multiple plateaus and you're getting kind of frustrated and adherence might be kind of starting to go, like, let's throw a diet break in if we have time to. And then and also, we talked about people who need longer preps. Someone with more to lose, ideally, I like to do kind of more of an extended diet break part of the way through if possible, where we take 4 or 6 weeks, something like that, out of a deficit, just to really break it up a little bit more for them. At maybe the half or 2/3 of the way through point, something like that. And that's what I've done with my last couple preps as well, is dieted off like the first 20-ish and then took a longer diet break and then made the push for the last 15-ish.
Okay.
So
So
um
for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no I
So for that individual who is already, let's say you're like, you have your last 15 pounds to lose, and we have, let's say 20 weeks to get that done. Would you, and it's like a person who like, hey, I'm super adherent. I don't necessarily prefer to take a diet break. I don't care either way. Would you just go ahead and like, okay, cool, let's push straight through? Or again, like in just relative to the context of everything that's like this has been discussed lately about diet breaks also, which is like one of the hotter topics. Do you think there's any benefit to still like, hey, like you do have plenty of time, let's go ahead and put a diet break at like the 8 pound down mark?
Yeah, I would say it depends on the person. I think if they stay adherent during it, they're on board for adding it, and they're going to be ready super early, it might not hurt to put it in. If they don't want to have one, like if they're not, like I'm good, whatever, maybe that's where you just can be a little more flexible about when you adjust, right? So like maybe you can be like one of those situations where it's like, rate of loss is, we're aiming for a pound a week. You saw about zero point 0.8 this week. That's where you might be able to say that's good enough. Like, you know what I mean? Because we have that time, right? And so you can just slow it down a little bit that way. And if they're ready a few weeks early, that's not a bad thing, because you can start looking at, okay, how do they look around their refeeds? What if we give them a higher, a more aggressive refeed? Do they look better or worse? Or, you know what I mean? Start getting some ideas for peak week. And then also, you can start working food up going into the show. And typically that helps someone fill out and look better. I had a bikini client a few years back where we were able to reverse her food up high enough that she filled out really, really well. And we did pretty much nothing for her peak week other than the fact we had reversed her in for the last 4 weeks, and she won a pro show. So,
Okay, cool.
yeah.
So from there, then it sounds like as a whole, diet breaks are still, would you say diet breaks, like from your perspective, are something you primarily just like from a psychological and adherence perspective, or something you introduce, or do you have
Yeah.
any
I mean, I don't know, I don't know how much it necessarily, the metabolic rate side of things, how much it has an effect. I mean, maybe if you take, it depends on how long a one you take though, because coming out of like a 4 to 6 week diet break, maybe for the first couple weeks you can get away with a little, you know what I mean, a little bit more when you pull back again. Just 1 week though, that's where the data is mixed. The two studies that are out there, the two longest term studies, if I'm remembering correctly, the one that didn't show a benefit of diet breaks on metabolic rate was 1 week diet breaks, and the other one that showed a benefit was 2 weeks. And so it could be possible that you just need, the more time you spend out of a deficit, the better. And I mean, that would make sense because, that's something we kind of know, right? Like if you spend a bunch of time out of a deficit, you're going to be in a better spot than if you're always dieting. And so maybe there's a benefit to longer diet breaks, but I mean, that lengthens prep. So it's got to be the right situation, right? Like you wouldn't want to do, like, I would never tell someone who's like 3 pounds over stage weight just to like diet break for 6 weeks,
right?
in situations. If we're doing a diet break that close to a show, it's probably just a week and then back at it to get that last little bit off.
Okay. Okay. Absolutely. So then when it comes to making calorie adjustments versus adding in cardio or adding in more movement, do you have like, hey, lean more this way versus the other, or can you fill us in on that?
Yeah, usually food is my first go-to, just because, I mean, that I would say if I'm looking at like priority list, like food is the first place I would look at. Probably steps and daily activity is the second, and then actual cardio is probably the third. Um, that's probably my pecking order. I mean, food is definitely the highest though, because it doesn't, like we talked about before, you can take away 10, 15 grams of carbs and a couple grams of fat, and that can get someone moving again. And that's not a huge reduction.
Right.
Um, you know, steps work all right too. Adding another 1,000 or a couple thousand steps, it's a little more movement to every day, and it's low enough intensity that most people can recover from it as long as you're not. I'm not a huge fan of extremes in step counts. I think that someone doing 20,000 steps a day just to be able to eat more is probably defeating their purpose, because I'm guessing that's you're one, there's some evidence that some of that involuntary stuff can downregulate, and you might not get as much bang for your buck at those crazy high step counts. And two, I just from a recovery standpoint in the gym, like I don't think that doing 20,000 steps a day, like unless that's just what your job requires or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, but
Right.
I like purposely adding that much extra activity to, I don't think that's a good idea either. I mean, like most things, like moderation's best. Like I don't think someone should be super sedentary, and I don't think someone should be running marathons every day. Like um, it's probably somewhere in the middle. So yeah, but cardio is kind of the last thing I use. I mean, I'll use it for people, but it's kind of that thing I keep in my back pocket for the, if we need to add it. But moderate and higher intensity forms of cardio can be harder to recover from, and so if someone's food's already low, they're lean, like I don't push a ton of, you know what I mean? Like some people have to push. Like I have clients doing 5, 6 days of cardio a week at the end of prep. But we didn't start there. But I tried to keep, that moderate and higher, especially the high intensity stuff down, as much as I can, just from a recovery standpoint. I know I mean, 2012, I remember my 2012 prep, like HIIT was like the thing in 2012. My 2012 prep, I was doing 4 sessions of HIIT a week, 2 steady state sessions, and like, still trying to lift legs twice a week. And my legs were dead before I even got in the gym to lift legs because I was doing HIIT 4 times a week. It's really hard to recover from. And so I typically find that if we can shift a little bit more of that activity to lower intensity, or maybe just get away, have a little bit less food, and to get away with some of that little bit less higher intensity stuff, usually performance in the gym stays up a little bit more. Someone recovers a little bit better, and that can mean a little more muscle retention than, doing a ton of cardio just to be able to eat more food.
Absolutely. And that's like the time perspective as well is something that you touched on that is so important. Just like adding more cardio is like adding more time, whereas taking away calories, if the person's going to adhere to it, is, hey, like I just eat a little bit less, right? It is not any less time out of my day.
Yeah, and like we said, that it doesn't have to be a ton. 10 to 15 grams of carbs and a couple grams of fat will probably get the job done most of the time, kind of as a general starting point.
Right, right, absolutely. So then when these individuals are getting down to, do you have a couple more minutes here? I apologize. I
Yeah,
know
sure.
we're half an hour. Cool. So when the individual is getting down to like, you are very, very lean, like this might be the last 5 pounds to lose, 10 pounds to lose. Are there any like special considerations that go into like how we approach that versus the rest of the diet?
Yeah, so I think, I think this is where, those last few pounds is where I really do think that in order to be a good coach, you have to have been there yourself.
Right.
You have to be able to relate to that. Like, I think when your client feels like absolute garbage because they're really lean and food's low and they're still pushing for more loss, and I think they need to know that, like, what they mean and what they're feeling like they need, that, like, I know that my clients have seen how lean I've been. They know I've been, like, and I've done it more than once. I've done it, plenty of times now. And so, um, I think just having that relatability, right? And so I think that's important. I also think, you have to kind of read the client too. Sometimes I've had situations where maybe I leave someone a couple pounds heavier than maybe I ideally would have.
Mhm.
just from an adherence standpoint, because I know like if I pushed a little bit further, they'd break. Just from everything I'm hearing from them. And so it really depends on the client. If someone comes in and they're like pro and I want to compete at like pro worlds and contend for a pro world championship, might have to do what you might, you know what I mean? Like that's your goal. You're going to, most of those people are usually also willing to do whatever they have to do, to get those last couple off. If it's someone's first show and they don't realize, because I mean, someone can tell you what that feels like and you can read about it in a book, but like until you've been there, you just don't understand. Like, you know what I mean? Like what being that lean feels like. And so, uh, if they're, so sometimes, like I said, for a beginner, it might just be leaving them a couple pounds shy and, let's improve for the next time around and, just make the first one successful, like rather than pushing them to the point they break.
Okay. Okay. Absolutely. So it sounds like more than anything else is like the mindset of the client rather than like any specific physiological considerations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean the physiologics. I mean, nothing's going to be great physiologically when you're that lean. Like,
Right.
um, hormone levels are not going to be good. Testosterone is going to be low, cortisol is going to be high, thyroid's going to be low. And someone who's drug free, a lot of women aren't going to have their cycle that lean, no matter how intelligent of a prep, slow of a prep you do.
Mhm.
Again, that lens that also brings us back to, hey, you need to have an off season and you should have a normal cycle most of the time, and that may mean for some women that their off season has to be longer because of
Right.
that. And then, but I mean, also just from like physiologically, like metabolic rates down, your strength's down, your energy's down, you sleep like crap, no sex drive, like like it's there isn't a lot of great things physiologically when you're that lean. It looks cool, but it doesn't feel great. And so, but that it is what it is to get to the extreme, and you get to where you need to go. You do your shows, and usually I try to tell clients, I generally recommend they do more than one show while they're lean, but I try to make sure that they're trying to do their shows within a couple months rather than dragging out the amount of time they're that lean. That way they can gain weight back and be in a normal place most of the time.
Okay. Okay. Absolutely. So it sounds like when you're absolutely peeled, like that upper limit of how long you want to keep people that lean is about 2 to 3 months. What do you say?
Yeah, usually if I can get everyone's shows in within a couple months, that's usually kind of what I like to do if possible. There are times that's not possible, but like I look at like my own last couple times I dieted down. So I did 3 shows in a photo shoot in 2016 and 3 shows in a photo shoot in 2020. And I think in 2016 I did that over 6 weeks, and in 2020 I did that over 5 weeks. So like once I got there, I just did everything, and I, you know what I mean, did so I didn't drag it out.
Right. Right. Okay. Cool. So then, final question on this: when like that post, okay, we've done the photo shoots, we've done the show, whatever. Is your approach to reverse dieting? Do you typically, and again, this might be something that depends. Do you lean more towards like a recovery diet, or is it just so independent or so dependent?
I would say I'm probably somewhere between the two, because like I don't know what people define it as at this point. Like I I think that you probably need to control the rate someone's weight's coming back on. I don't think that doing whatever and just gaining everything back right away is a good idea, because you typically do end up seeing people's body weight and body fat higher than when they started their cut if they just binge their way out. Like it takes metabolic rate hormones time to catch up. Even if you gain weight quickly and food's high and all of that. I also think that you have to gain weight after a show. Well, if you've gotten lean enough, you have to gain weight after a show. So, this is kind of a complete side note, but I think one mistake a lot of people make is that they don't get stage lean. Maybe they have 10 or 15 pounds to lose yet, going into their first show,
Right.
and they do their show, and then they treat the show as if they've gotten stage lean. Um, you don't need to treat the, you know what I mean? Like in that situation, you don't need to be gaining like someone who got stage lean. But assuming someone's gotten stage lean, I like to see like a 1 to 2 pound a week gain for the first, you know, probably 6, 8 weeks till they start to feel more normal, and then slow it down from there. Um, I'm usually fairly aggressive. Like I usually tell clients going into a show, like, listen, we want to push your intake high enough that one, you can actually adhere to it, and two, you can be, when you're consistently adhering to it, you are gaining. And so that might mean a pretty significant jump. Like I had a client compete. Um, if I have a client compete, for example, and they're at, let's say it's a guy and they're eating like 2,500 calories a day at the end of prep and they're losing weight there, we might be jumping to like 3,200 or, you know what I mean? Something like that to start. And that may not be like, a lot of times I'll tell clients after their show, like, enjoy some food Saturday night, enjoy some food Sunday. Let's get started on your numbers Monday. They might get started with 3,200 calories. That guy might, his weight will spike from eating some food for a day and a half or whatever. He by Wednesday, after like 3,200 for a couple of days, he'll probably see some stabilization there. Like it's not going up anymore, and so I may even push that further. And then I tell him, like, let's go to 3,400. Let's see where you're at Friday. If that's still not up, then I might say, all right, let's go to like 3,600 and see where you're at by like Sunday or Monday. You know what I mean? Like I don't, at first I am really aggressive to get them gaining. And then from there, let's gain a pound or two a week for the first month, month, 6, 8 weeks, whatever, until you start to feel more normal. And then we'll slow things, because you don't need to be gaining 2 pounds a month, indefinitely. That's a good way to rush into a cut. And you don't want to be rushing into a cut, So my goal after a show is spend the first 6, 8 weeks getting you feeling more normal. From there, let's slow rate of gain so that it's a long time before you diet again. Because the last thing you should be doing anytime soon when you come out of a prep is dieting. I just did the math on this the other day. I think it's been like 38 weeks since my last show last summer. And I've been out of deficit the entire time. Like, the last thing you want to be doing, in those first months out of a show is dieting.
Okay, absolutely. So it sounds like very much though you're not like, hey, from your deficit, we're going to add another 50 calories this week, like the classic,
No.
like 10 carbs, like jumping to at very least predicted maintenance or slightly above, correct?
Yeah, hopefully slightly above, but yes. And if it's not slightly above, like I said, I give it a couple days and push. Like if they're, it's really hard to stay adherent, like after your show and the show's done. A lot of people really struggle with that. And so, I'll bump, like I said, hopefully above maintenance. That guy who's eating 25, if we start at 32, that's 700 calories more a day. And that still might not be enough to get him gaining. But if he can at least be adherent, like Monday, Tuesday on those numbers, and he's still not gaining, okay, 34, 35, we got to get you gaining, and if he can be adherent there for, you know what I mean? Like I always tell clients, if you can just be adherent with me here, like I will be super aggressive with you here. Like, let's get this going. And I think a lot of people would be really surprised if they're adherent post-show, how high their food has to get, even right away, and how quickly they can get it there in order to gain. Like a lot of the rapid gain that happens post-show is inconsistency. It's not usually people pushing their targets too high to start. Like most people, doing their own prep probably don't think like, hey, I'm going to give myself an extra 700, 800,000 calories. You know what I mean? Like within a week of my show. But a lot of people, not everybody, again, an individual, but a lot of people can get away with that, or that might be what's needed, coming out of a deficit to see that 1 or 2 pounds a week. And by being more aggressive like that at the start too, it helps with adherence, and like I said, I just think that's so huge coming out of a show, because, it can be really hard to be adherent coming out of a show. And like I said, the rapid gain and those crazy stories of crazy fast gain you hear coming out of a show, it's typically it's just from not being able to adhere, and oftentimes it's because you're trying to be too conservative and not adding food back quickly enough.
Absolutely, that makes complete sense. And like so much of that too, like how much body fat you have on your frame to a large extent determines how you feel. And at this point, I didn't know, I've been there trying to just stay shredded for so long, and it's like, it doesn't matter how much I'm eating, I still feel absolutely terrible. My training is in the tank. I can't build muscle, so I just need to be okay with gaining a bit of fat back. But it sounds like you have a good method for like, rather than, okay, well, fuck it, I'm just gonna eat whatever. Like we are gaining back, but it's in a very controlled manner.
Yeah, it's finding that middle ground. I mean, with a lot of this stuff, it's middle ground. I know like the fitness industry and bodybuilding, everyone wants to be in one extreme or the other, but it's really somewhere in the middle. That's typically best. In most things, right? Like it's not one extreme or the other.
Absolutely. This has been super insightful, man. I want to be respectful of your time, and I know we're already over here. So before I let you go, will you just tell everyone where they can find you, anything you might want to plug, any projects you have coming up, anything like that?
Yeah. So you can find me, my website, fitbodyphysique.com. I actually just had that recently redone. So my 2014 design is now a 2021 design. So I'm pretty
Oh,
pumped about that. Yeah, so yeah, my website, you can find me at Instagram. I'm at fitbodyphysique. My own name on Facebook. And then you can pick up our book, Bodybuilding, the Complete Contest Prep Handbook, on Amazon for I think it's like $20 on.
such a good book too. Can't recommend that one enough. I will link all that up in the show notes. And again, man, thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.